Hi, I'm Jay Fear, and today we're at the Minokan Farm for our annual garden tour. And our featured speaker today is John Stika, who's going to talk to us about no-till gardening and gardening in general, and he's a longtime soil health advocate. So I hope you enjoy the presentation.
So in my book, A Soil Owner's Manual, I thought it's important not only to help people learn about soil health, but from all my years of teaching, I always saw that it was critical that people change their thinking. So the paradigm shift, the paragraph or the chapter on the paradigm shift, I thought was important so that people realize how much they're going to have to change their thinking. And if they're not prepared to do that, then the rest of what they need to learn isn't going to be that useful if they're not willing to change their thinking. And changing your thinking from a disturbed soil, a degraded soil that we've come to accept as normal, to a fully functioning biological soil is a big leap. We've been looking at degraded soils for hundreds of years, depending on where you are in the world, and we've accepted that as that's normal. That's just the way the soil is, and it's not. It's severely degraded, and so for people to make that paradigm shift from the soil is degraded, I didn't realize that, to this is what it could be. That's huge. To accept that, to realize that is huge. And to get people to that point, I think needs to happen up front. Otherwise, they're not going to make a change. And the change in thinking and what I've seen in other people, I can look back on my own experience growing up on a dairy in Wisconsin, and we tilled everything. And I can remember being out in the field, tilling a field and having to go over it 2 or 3 times because the soil was still just like big rocks. It wasn't like soil. And so I was out there, beating this stuff to pieces so the planter would work. And even at that time, I thought, this isn't good. This isn't right. And if you look at a soil someplace that wasn't disturbed, or not disturbed for a long time, it was in alfalfa for 5 or 6 years, and you broke that out, that soil behaved completely differently. So there were some things even then that I started thinking about and realizing there's something that we're not understanding, we're not incorporating into agriculture that needs to be. Assuming that people have made the paradigm shift in thinking that soil is a biological system, now how do I develop an approach to making this happen? And everyone has to develop their own approach because they have their own soil, they have their own workforce, they have their own budget, they have their own manpower. So every solution is going to be different, and different climates, all those things is, how am I going to do this? And I tell people to start with, think about the 4 principles of restoring soil health: less disturbance, more diversity, living roots, and keep the soil covered. Think of those 4 things and how good of a job are you doing with those 4 things. You may be doing a real good job with diversity, but you're still doing too much disturbance, or you're not keeping the soil covered all the time. And focus on those things. Which one of these 4 things do I really need to improve on? And focus on those and start small. Don't try and do it on your whole farm or even in your whole garden. Just pick an area and apply these principles. And then you have to stick with it, because it's not going to happen overnight. It's not something you can spread on the soil and it's instantly repaired. It's going to take 3 years, 4 years, depending on how much you do and how you do it. So you have to be willing to stick with it, not just, okay, I'll apply these principles for a while and then it's not really what I want, so I'm going to go back to what I was doing. You have to stay with it for an extended period of time, and it's not going to look that good. It's not going to function that well for a year or 2 years, but at the third year, the fourth year, then you're going to start to see, okay, things are changing, things are really improving, and now I'm more confident. And then that's when I see people say, okay, now I'm confident that this works. I'm going to do it on my whole garden. I'm going to do it on my whole farm. On the subject of cover crops, that goes back a long way. You can read things that Thomas Jefferson did regarding cover crops and the benefits he saw, because they didn't have pesticides, they didn't have a lot of things we have today, so they had to rely on cover crops. The thing with cover crops, I think, why they've become so popular, why it's become such a powerful tool again, is when you look at the 4 soil health principles of less disturbance, more diversity, living roots, and keep the soil covered. Cover crops do 3 of those things automatically. If you have a mixture in your cover crop, it's not just one species. Not that that's a failure, there's anything wrong with that if you did one species, but to do a multi-species cover crop, you get the diversity, you get the living roots, you get the cover all at the same time. And so it addresses such a big part of building soil health very quickly in one application, in one shot. Okay, on the subject of crop diversity, that's really where we're at with a lot of the producers that have taken the step of reducing tillage. They've done a good job with that. They've moved to no-till systems. People who quit tilling their garden, whatever the case is, they've made the decision to not disturb the soil anymore. But particularly in agriculture, they're still not comprehending how important diversity is. And so they're still managing their system with only 1 or 2 crops, corn and soybeans. So nature has kind of a magic number that's somewhere around 5 to 7. And until you get to 5 to 7 species, the system really doesn't move forward. And that's where a lot of people are in no-till systems. They're moving forward. So livestock come in and will typically take the part of the plant that they want, because they know what their nutritional needs are. And when they do that, they stimulate those plants. And those plants will send sugars down into the soil to feed the microorganisms in the soil, because they need to recruit them to help supply nutrients and water to regrow. And even in a cover crop, cattle will do that. They'll take part of the plant off. They won't necessarily take the entire plant all in one shot. So you have this stimulation happening until the cover crop is finally grazed to the point that you've determined that's enough and I need to leave some soil cover. With perennial plants, same thing. They bite those plants, they stimulate them, they feed the soil organisms, they get them active and going to support the plant. So it's a big microbial boost of food, of sugar from that the plants have made with photosynthesis to get that biology active. There's a fair amount of biology in the soil that is dormant a lot of the time. Until a root shows up with some food, or an earthworm shows up, or something else happens in the soil, those organisms are dormant. They're not wasting energy. But when a food source like a root or a worm or something shows up, then they wake up and they go to work and they're active, and you want them building aggregates. You want them building carbon in the soil. You don't want them laying there sleeping. So grazing is perfect stimulation for those plants, and as long as it's properly managed. Yeah, restoring landscapes, whether it's with a grazing system or a cropping system, I think it all comes down to getting the soil well aggregated again so that water can move into the soil. And so if you manage your grazing to properly manage and stimulate the plants so they're feeding the organisms and creating lots of stable aggregates, or in your cropping system, you're doing the 4 principles, the 5 principles, however many principles you want to use to build soil aggregates. Once the water starts moving into the soil, then you have restored your hydrologic cycle. The water moves in the soil, it transpires through plants, it doesn't just run off, it doesn't get waylaid somewhere, in the system. And then the whole landscape responds because now the water is accessible to the plants recover. As the plants recover, they feed the organisms, the aggregates continue to build, and your hydrologic cycle, your nitrogen cycle all start to function again. Food security is become a bigger issue again, and victory gardens in the past, where people needed to be more self-reliant because the supply of food were short or interrupted due to the war, things like that. I think we can feed ourselves to a pretty fair extent. I look at my own garden that's only little over 20 feet by 40 feet. And what I raise in that garden, we don't finish eating what I raise in the garden from one year until I'm just about ready to harvest the next year, the following year. Food that we've canned or is in the freezer, whatever the case might be. So you can raise an amazing amount of food in a very small area, and it can be managed just the way you want it to manage it. If you don't want pesticides, then you don't need to put on pesticides. If however you want to manage it and whatever you want to grow, that's your food security. That can be a big part of your food security. And if your soil is healthy and functioning, you can grow all of that, and you can grow a lot more of that with very few inputs. So you're not relying on, am I able to go buy this input? I don't want my garden to be dependent on my ability to go find some input that I have to put on there, fertilizer, whatever, to make it grow. Well, we look at carbon in the ecosystem in a lot of different ways. We look at it in the atmosphere, we look at it in the soil, we look at it in our food, all these different things. And when people ask about what chemical element is critical for agricultural production, if you ask most producers, they'll tell you nitrogen, because that's what they apply. They're buying nitrogen and applying nitrogen, when in fact it's carbon, because carbon is the energy, it's the currency of the soil. And everything in the soil relies on that for the structure of the soil, where they're going to live, what they're going to eat, where they're going to derive their energy from. And they derive their energy from living plants that do photosynthesis, grab the carbon dioxide from the air, bring it into the soil. So to manage that so that the carbon always moves from the air to the soil to support the system, we're taking that carbon dioxide out of the air and putting it back in the soil where a lot of it came from. There was a lot of organic matter in the soil at one time that there isn't now. And so to put that carbon back in the soil is critical to get it to function. So we can add carbon to a system by applying biochar, by applying compost, by applying manure, and that's fine. That's all well and good. But to get the quality carbon, the quality organic matter, only biology can build that. Only plants and organisms in the soil can build that in the soil. These other things can help. They can be a part of the picture, but only plants and organisms can really build the quality of organic matter that's in the soil. And getting back to carbon and food security, it's also the quality of what you're growing in the soil. It's very difficult to grow quality, nutritious vegetables in degraded soil. The plants have a very difficult time working with biological partners that are not there. If all those partners are there, the plants can move all of their processes up to a higher and higher level, bigger and bigger molecules, more complex sugars and lipids and proteins. That's where the nutrition comes from the plants. So without healthy functioning soil, it's pretty difficult to grow the quality of food. You can grow the quantity, but it's difficult to grow the quality of food without all those biological partners in the soil. Just on the whole soil health movement, if you will, if you want to call it that, I spent the first 15 years or so of my career, my crusade, to teach people about soil health, just trying to get it on people's radar screen, just to get them familiar with the term and the concept. The last 10 or 15 years, it's really starting to get some traction where people now understand the concepts, have applied them long enough that they see that things are improving, that things are happening and going in a positive direction. And I think it's finally off the chain and it's running on its own, where there's enough people realizing the economic benefits of managing for soil health. And I really think we're at a crossroads in agriculture in particular. The folks that understand and apply and build soil health, and the folks that don't. And the folks that don't, I don't think their time in agriculture is much longer. Economically, I don't see how they can continue with degraded soil and lots of inputs. The economics are just not there. So I'm hopeful that they start to catch on and they start to realize what they need to do. If they don't, then big picture, the people that do understand it are going to end up with that land one way or another.